Hi, it's Dwyer. It's September 28th, 2024. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. DwyerBoxingNews.com, a free site. Let's talk boxing. Let's be a bit controversial here. My dad would cringe. But let's pick our top 7 most skilled heavyweight champions in history here, right? Let me pause here and let me point out that this is a different list than the most influential heavyweight champions, right? We're talking about the guys who I consider to be the most skilled, right? Let me point out too that some of these guys fought each other in what I consider to be some of the biggest fights in heavyweight history. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Understand, this is the kind of thing we should be sitting around a bar talking about. There are no truly right answers. Right? History has had many very skilled fighters. Let me also point out, too, that we're going to deviate here from the public narrative. This is just my list. Right? Understand, I was raised in a Joe Louis household. Louis is well before my time. Right? But understand, my father loved him. I ended up watching a lot of Louis matches. Right? And this was before there were VCRs. I'm talking about if Marv Albert and somebody else had some boxing program on Joe Louis, my dad was in front of the TV. Joe Louis did not make my list. Let's go further. My favorite fighter in history is Jack Johnson. He did not make my list. Jack Dempsey, boxing's first $1 million purse, did not make my list. Nor did Floyd Patterson. Nor did the heavyweight champion when I became aware of boxing, Joe Frazier. Nor did unbeaten Rocky Marciano. Nor did Ken Norton. Michael Spinks, who deserves an asterisk. He's not on the list in part because of lack of longevity at heavyweight. Deontay Wilder. Anthony Joshua. Gene Tunney. John L. Sullivan. Based on the limited films I've seen, and in some cases what I've heard, I've not seen a film of John L. Sullivan. These men did not make my list. Some of them in part because boxing has evolved. As great defensively as Jack Johnson is, right? Just understand the sport is different now than it was then. So, understanding the controversy, understanding that I can't be right whatever I say in this video, that the comment section, which I invite you to participate in, is going to be filled with, Dwyer, you're crazy. What about this fighter? What about that fighter? Let me just give my top 7 skill-wise based on my own review of the videos here on YouTube, and also my understanding as to the strengths and weaknesses of the fighters and who they fought. Right? The first is, in fact, we'll make this a top 8 list because as I'm giving this intro, I just thought of a fighter that I had omitted. So, number 1 on my list, and then the rest of the list is random. But the best heavyweight that I have seen in history is young Ali. The Ali who's champion, who fights Cleveland Williams. Right? Understand, Ali at that point had spectacular reflexes. Right? He's a young guy. Understand, many of these guys I'm going to name are time period specific because this fighter did not exist by the time he gets to the 1970s. We're talking about the Ali with the reflexes who's a risk taker. The hand speed is so blinding that when Williams, a puncher, tries to come inside on him, Ali knows that at that point he can bust off a combination and that his punches will get there first. The combinations are breathtaking. He is not a pot shotter. He doesn't show his legs that much in the Cleveland Williams fight, but you understand they're there. Because that fight, of course, took place after he had fought Sonny Liston twice and many other people. In terms of legs, Ali in the 60s has the best legs in the heavyweight division that I know of. So we're talking about top end timing, a mobile jab, right? Very good jab that he could throw on the move, right? We're talking about top end hand speed, and we're talking about a fighter who is fearless. In other words, it cost him, right? He gets dropped by Sonny Banks, for example. But understand, he's willing to take risks to be great. In other words, he is carrying his hands low because he wants them for offense. He wants them to be free. So a fighter like Cleveland Williams, and keep in mind, Williams, one of the biggest punchers of the 60s, fought Sonny Liston. You'll see a clip of the fight on my Gambler's Advisory page, right? Fought Liston twice. You know, Big Cat was a big name. The fight is in Big Cat's backyard, right, in Texas. And the Ali who shows up, in my opinion, is the most skilled heavyweight in the heavyweight division. Now, let's be controversial here. By the time we get to the 70s, Ali has lost the physical gifts. He no longer has anything remotely resembling the legs he had. Understand, this is a guy who won the heavyweight title at 22 years old. Right? He doesn't have the ability to float like a butterfly in the 1970s. Right? He's diminished. He's still able to beat people like Jerry Quarry out the gate. Frazier beats him the first time. The second fight's tainted. Ali does win the third fight, barely. He has a problem with Kenny Norton, who breaks his jaw. Right? Understand, this Ali would have done much better than the real Ali, who actually fights through the 1970s. Let's talk about, in no particular order, some other fighters on my top 8 list, we'll call it. In fact, we'll stick to 7. Sonny Liston. Early 60s Sonny Liston. Now, I don't say this lightly. Liston's jab was better than Ali. Liston's jab is a 10 out of 10. If you're looking for great jabs, the kind of jab where the guy wouldn't have to throw anything else if he didn't want to, I need for people to focus on Sonny Liston's jab. Now, Ali's jab is a mobile jab. Right? Liston's jab is more stationary. Liston is far more pocket-centric than Ali. Right? But I need for folks to understand, Liston's jab's so good that you would think he was left-handed, but for Liston's spectacular right hand. Understand who Liston was in the pocket. Folks, in my opinion, there's no one better in the pocket. Right? Floyd Patterson comes out the first fight against Liston and runs over to him. Look at the film. It's Patterson who's the aggressor against Sonny Liston. Patterson, the then heavyweight champion. Just understand that when he gets to Liston, he's systematically outboxed, doesn't make it out of the first round. Liston had a certain punching style, and it's unique. Another boxer on this list had it, where he would lock his hands Most guys will throw a punch and let their hands carry the punch, right? I'll throw a left hook and I'll be moving my arm. Look closely at the Liston film. Liston would lock his arm and then move his body. Right, folks? That made his punches more concussive. Let me say this too. Don't view Liston as a bully. View Liston as a technician. You're not going to find better defense in the pocket. He's fighting Cleveland Williams, who comes out and hurts him. Hurts him. Right? Early in that fight, Liston stays in the pocket. If you want to fault Liston, he doesn't have much of a back foot. I'll agree with that. But Liston stays in the pocket against Big Cat. Then you'll notice he solves Big Cat is blocking the shots in the pocket. Then, of course, gets the early KO. I know some people are going to talk about Liston's chin. Leotis Martin was on Ring Magazine's top 100 hardest punchers in history. Understand the Ali rematch where Liston goes down. He loses his title in the first fight on a stool. But the rematch is Liston in transition. Right? Liston is coming forward, gets caught by what we now call the phantom punch. I believe he is hit. Right? If he's not hit, if you see his head, how it jolts, he deserves an Oscar for that performance. Right? I believe you would have to get Liston in transition to hurt him. Or you would have to be his former sparring partner who knew him well, and that's who Leotis Martin was. And then get Liston into the later rounds of a fight Liston's winning. And catch him with one of the biggest shots that anyone could throw to drop him. Right? Liston had a chin on him. So Sonny Liston, particularly after looking at all these fighters in the pocket, right? Looking at the debacle that was Anthony Joshua against Daniel Dubois recently. Of all the guys I've seen in the pocket, Sonny Liston is really the best at heavyweight in the pocket. Right? He's on my list. Let's talk about some others on my list, right? Top 7. Tyson Fury. Now understand, I concede this openly. Fury right now is a little bit past his prime. We're talking about a different fighter. Just like Ali in the 60s is different from Ali in the 70s. The Tyson Fury who fights Vladimir Klitschko beats every other Tyson Fury out there who came after him. Right? You're talking about 6'9", incredible reach and coordination. You're talking about great legs, not good legs. You're talking about great legs. You're talking about a mobile jab. You're talking about great timing where he's in against a knockout puncher. And he's able to put both hands behind his back. Right? I don't believe current Fury would be able to do this. Right? It goes without saying that that level of dexterity, that confidence in your reflexes, right? You're not going to see that from a Deontay Wilder, from an Anthony Joshua, from, in other words, Fury's main competitors, right, during a portion of his prime. Usyk has come along, even though Usyk's older than Fury, Usyk has come along a little bit after Fury's prime, right? Understand, too. The Tyson Fury who fades, right, fades against Usyk, didn't exist when he was younger. Fury had excellent stamina when he was younger. Right? Now let me point out the problems with the fighters I've named, right? Ali, chin problem. Right? Ali, no body attack. Sonny Liston, size problem. Right, folks? Liston, big puncher, is actually smaller than Usyk. Right? Tyson Fury, chin problem. Getting knocked down by cruiserweights. He also had, in my opinion, an approach problem. Right? This is a guy who lived, we'll call it a Roberto Duran lifestyle. Right? This is a guy who was out eating good food, maybe drinking a little bit too much between fights. I believe it detracted from him. Understand, he signs to fight Klitschko in a much-needed rematch. I believe that rematch would have shown the complete talent gap between the two guys. And Klitschko, of course, had been a multi-year champion. Fury, at that moment, showed signs of mental instability, gained a lot of weight at that moment. Right? This was not an Evander Holyfield type guy. This was not a guy who was always in shape. This was a guy who proverbially fell off the wagon at times. It cost him. Understand the level of talent we're talking about here. He's ambidextrous to the point where there are fights leading into the Klitschko fight where Fury fights entire rounds left-handed. Right? I disagree with Ben Davison. I think ambidexterity is a huge advantage. Right? Just look at Terence Crawford. This guy had ambidexterity nobody else on this list had. Right? I believe in his prime, a Tyson Fury would beat a Martin Bakole. Right? Bakole is a big guy, but Bakole can't match Klitschko's movement. Fury's movement. Right? I believe Martin Bakole would beat Alexander Usyk. I know that's controversial. We'll see what happens when that fight happens. They've sparred together already. Right? I think Usyk has come upon us at the right time, during an era of big clunky heavyweights. I believe Tyson Fury, by contrast, would do well against Ali, Liston. Right? Some guys in history are just too small for him. I believe this guy dominates against big clunky heavyweights. I'm talking about the version of Tyson Fury who beat Klitschko. And I believe he had enough going on to compete against the earlier, smaller era of heavyweights. Now, I'll agree, a critic will say, well, what about Steve Cunningham knocking him down? Isn't his big weakness more coordinated guys? Right? How would he keep Joe Frazier off of him? Right? Those are all valid questions. I believe he would do well against most. Right? Tyson Fury's on my list. The Tyson Fury who beat Vladimir Klitschko. Let me point out that by the time Tyson Fury fights Deontay Wilder, he's a diminished version of himself. Right? He's like Ali against Jerry Quarry. Right? Ali won that fight. That's Ali's comeback after being in Boxing Siberia. Well, understand, Tyson Fury is the analog to Ali. He fights Deontay Wilder and should have been awarded the fight. He dominates Wilder, gets dropped twice in that fight. I'll agree, his chin's not top-notch. Right? But understand, that version of Tyson Fury is a shell of who Fury was. Let's talk about some more. George Foreman. I know, many people are going to say, come on, man, how long was Foreman champion? Right, folks, for more defenses than Sonny Liston was champion. Both of them who sparred together. Right, who, hung out with people like Joe Louis, Archie Moore. Both of them belong on the list. Foreman has better defense than Liston. Understand, Foreman's much bigger than Liston. Right? Foreman's nickname was Big George Foreman. Foreman's jab, like Liston's jab, is a 10 out of 10. Foreman's power is such that to me, Foreman is even a more fearsome puncher than Lennox Lewis. Right? I mean, sure, in boxing history, you have some guys with big punches. Foreman has among the biggest punches I've seen. This is a blessed puncher. Foreman also extremely savvy. Right? This is the guy who, has his hands up, is blocking shots, then knows how to lean on you to tire you out between shots. You won't find a better leaner than this guy. Right? Foreman, too, is a guy who pushed the rules. Right? Foreman against Joe Frazier. Frazier, fearless, is trying to come inside on George. George uses both hands, not one hand, he uses both hands and is pushing Joe off of him illegally. You'll see this move too, by the way, in the Lennox Lewis-Mike Tyson fight in a different generation. Right? The ref doesn't stop Foreman from pushing Frazier off of him. Foreman uses the ref's negligence against Frazier by then starting landing big shots after Frazier tries to continually crash the pocket. Right? This is a risk taker too. Not many guys stay in the pocket against Joe Frazier. That's what this guy did. Now, like Liston, we can say, hey, Foreman didn't have a great back foot. Right? That's true. That's true. But to force Foreman on his back foot would take a hell of a lot of effort. Right? Now, the problem Foreman had is his stamina. Right? I believe Foreman's slow hand speed, and it is slow, actually helped him because it got opponents to try to open up against him. Now, clearly, since I have Ali on this list already, we understand that, in my eyes, the Rumble in the Jungle is one of the special moments in boxing. You can't look at Foreman. Granted, he's facing an older 30-something-year-old Ali, right, who's not the Ali who I have on this list. But you can't fault Foreman for losing that fight, where, of course, the ref, look at the count. The ref gave Foreman less time to get off the canvas than Tyson Fury had against Deontay Wilder. But let's just say the problem with boxing is we'll see Liston lose to Ali. We'll see a Foreman lose to Ali. And then we won't consider a Liston or a Foreman to be among the best ever skill-wise in the division. I believe both are. Let's talk about another guy. Mike Tyson. But here again, there are two Mike Tysons. Right? There's the Mike Tyson in the 1980s. That's the guy on this list. The guy who Bone Crusher Smith is hugging onto for dear life. The guy who gets one shot on Michael Spinks and that fight is over in the first round. The guy who tracks down Larry Holmes, who, granted, is past his prime at that point. But understand, Larry, after the Tyson fight, would go on to beat Ray Mercer. Just food for thought. I mean, understand, Larry still had some gas left in the tank. Right? Neither of those Spinks fights are definitive. Right? Larry is still better than, I'd say, 98% of the heavyweight division when Tyson beats him. And Tyson does so by stoppage. Right? Tyson, of course, great head movement. Spectacular power, sudden power in both hands. Could fight low. Right? Mike would come in, he'd come in a crouch. Understand, Tyson wore black trunks in part because one of his heroes, Jack Dempsey, wore black trunks. Right? Tyson and Dempsey, in their biggest fights, both found a way to push the issue very early in the fight. Right? Let me say this too. Tyson, young Tyson, The one before the guy who fought Buster Douglas could duck under a jab. Throwing a jab against young Tyson was perilous. Now I understand. People are going to say Tyson moved in straight lines. He wasn't much of a circle, lateral movement type guy. We understand Tyson, a slugger like Liston, like Foreman. You didn't really see Tyson on his back foot. Right? The argument is going to be made that Tyson didn't have the full game that a Larry Holmes in his prime had. Okay, fair enough. I'm not saying these guys are perfect. I'm just saying they're the most skilled guys in the heavyweight division. Right? This Tyson left very little margin for error. Understand, people were afraid of him. Right? Look at the odds in the Buster Douglas fight. The next guy on this list, and so far we've named Ali, Liston, Tyson Fury, Foreman, Mike Tyson. The next guy is Lennox Lewis. Spectacular overhand right. You want to see great overhand rights, folks? Look at Lennox Lewis's overhand right. It's spectacular, and he was able to get it off in fights. This is not a guy who was afraid to throw it. Lewis, viewed as a big heavyweight, knew how to use length. Right? Lewis would fight a David Tua, huge puncher. We thought Tua was the next Tyson. People forget the fighters who we thought were going to be great, who Lewis fought. Right? Michael Grant, unbeaten, coming into the Lewis fight. Well, against Tua, Lewis, who had great boxing skills, knew that he had the height and reach on Tua, and Tua had ring coverage. So Lewis, of course, was just about winning. That's who the guy was. He was just about winning, whatever it took. His ego wasn't such, even though he had an ego that prevented him from training properly for several fights. Even though he had an ego, his mindset was such that against a David Tua, he set it up so that fight was not going to start until Tua could get close to him. And folks, Tua couldn't get close to him. Right? Lewis would throw a jab. He had an underrated jab. It was very good. Not quite Liston, not quite Foreman, but it was very good. Right? And understand, Lewis could connect the dots. You literally had to get Lewis out of his construct. Some fighters did. That Ray Mercer fight is rough and tumble, folks. Right? The Frank Bruno fight had tough moments for Lennox Lewis. But if you didn't raise room temperature, you were going to have problems. Obviously, Vitali Klitschko, where Lewis is struggling against him, raised room temperature. But you're talking about real intelligence here and execution. Let me also say, too, we forget that Lewis was a risk taker. Right? The Galata fight, Lewis, I believe, decides in the middle of the first round, not even at the beginning of the fight, middle of the first round. This guy can't match my hand speed. I'm going to make this an issue. Starts throwing heavy power shots. The Michael Grant fight, which took place in the United States. Right? Grant was supposed to be some fearsome puncher and stuff like that. Lewis decides he's going to fight dirty. I'm not kidding. This is almost a Foreman move, right? In fact, Foreman might be embarrassed by this move. While Foreman was a guy who would push you and stuff like that, Lewis actually starts holding Grant with one hand and punching him with the other. Right? It's clear that Lewis decided early in that fight that he wanted the early stoppage, which he got. Right? A different ref might have disqualified him in that fight. Let's just say Lewis, when he wanted to, could be borderline on the rules. Right? This guy, to me, great fighter. Now, the problem with Lewis, I mentioned it earlier, training. Lewis, I believe, knew he was the best. Right? But Lewis would show up, that first Hasim Rahman fight, folks, Lewis looked flabby when they introduced him. Look at his body. right? Lewis looked like, the Frank Bruno fight. You would think that Lewis would show up for that fight in the best shape of his career, right? That's a territorial fight. Both guys are from the UK. You would think that's a fight for the countrymen, right? Just out of national pride, you would think Lewis would show up with an attitude. Lewis showed up in that fight and had bad stamina in that fight. Right? I would say Lewis, like Tyson Fury, in fact, a few of these guys, took training in a lackadaisical way. Right? Ali famously went looking for Sonny Liston before their fight. Right? Ali was media conscious. He wanted to confront Sonny. And of course, where did he find Sonny? And it wasn't that long before the fight, he finds Sonny at the Baccarat table in a casino in Vegas. Right? That's who Liston was. A lot of these guys didn't train like fighters train today. That includes Lennox Lewis. Right? Let me also say, too, that Lewis was maddening. In other words, Riddick Bowe was a huge name in the early 90s. Lennox Lewis was the mandatory contender. You thought that Lewis would say, hey man, keep in mind they fought each other in the Olympics in 1988. There was bad blood. In fact, Lewis was helping HBO or some outfit announce a fight, a Riddick Bowe fight. And Riddick Bowe's leaving the ring, and of course Bowe had some choice words for Lewis, who turned to him and said, bring it on, mate. And there was an open question on whether guys would start throwing punches right there. But Lewis was a businessman. I believe Lewis thought that he was the best and he was going to get his opportunity regardless. So Lewis accepted step-aside money. Millions of dollars. Right? It made him a millionaire. But just understand, that's who Lewis was. Boxing was a math equation for him. Right? This is a guy who would take step-aside money. Many fighters wouldn't. Right? You have a scene right now at Bridgerweight where Kevin Lorraine is saying, hey, I don't want step-aside money. I don't want to hear about other fighters and promoters and stuff like that. I want my shot right now. That wasn't Lennox Lewis. Let's talk about another guy who to me is among the best I've seen. Vitali Klitschko. Folks, he's the best in terms of center of gravity. Right? You want a guy who is always in a position to block shots and to throw power shots. Right? You don't want a guy who's going to be caught in transition like Sonny Liston was in that Ali rematch. Right? Vitali Klitschko, my God, he was the tall guy who could lean. Right, folks? I've seen countless tall guys leaning forward. Right? I don't want to pick on guys. I've already picked on a couple of heavyweights. Let's just say this guy was a master at leaning backward. And he was also defensively blessed. Revisit the Chris Arreola fight in LA. That's the other thing, too. This Ukrainian guy is traveling to places like LA to fight Arreola. He's flying to Poland to fight Tomas Ademic. And folks, his opponents are getting the daylights beaten out of them. Right? Arreola, high volume, is on his front foot. You thought something's got to give here. Right? If Klitschko leans back, Arreola's going to crash the pocket and catch him out of position. Right, folks? That's not what happened. Keep in mind, this guy used to be a kickboxer. What happens in the Arreola fight looks like a kung fu movie. Arreola comes forward, is throwing all kind of volume. Klitschko is picking it off with his forearms. You have to see it to believe it. It's one of the best performances I've seen in my life. Then, of course, Klitschko starts throwing his own shots. One of the open questions in boxing, and to me it's still one of the best matches I've ever seen in my life. One of the open questions is, what would have happened in that Lennox Lewis Vitali Klitschko match if Klitschko didn't get the cut over his eye? Granted, it's a gash. It's a bad cut. I'm not saying the fight should have been stopped. Also, in boxing, if you're fighting a guy and he hits you above the eye and, a cut happens and there's blood and it's bleeding into the eye, okay, the other guy has an advantage. Right? Lewis got the cut on Klitschko. Okay, great. Right? I'm not complaining about the outcome. But what I am saying is here you had a Hall of Fame heavyweight champion. A guy who had been on a run, who had beaten Michael Grant not long before that fight. A guy who had beaten Evander Holyfield, I would say twice. The judges said the first was a draw, right? A guy who had beaten Mike Tyson. You had a legitimate heavyweight champion, a guy who was undisputed at one point. And here he is against a guy who's in the pocket, right? Lip of the pocket, long reach. Klitschko was able to stay outside but was around the pocket. In other words, Klitschko's not running from Lennox Lewis. And folks, the first 3 rounds of that fight are probably the best 3 rounds we've seen against Lennox Lewis. Right? Understanding that Oliver McCall is really a one-punch knockout. Understanding that Hasim Rahman's really a one-punch knockout. The Klitschko-Lewis fight is different. Klitschko's actually outboxing Lennox Lewis. Right? Then Lewis makes some adjustments. It's still rough and tumble. And of course, Lennox Lewis doesn't look like he properly trained for the fight. Right? Lewis looks winded. Both guys are holding on. Notably, Lewis at times is holding on. Right? Let me also name another fight. And this guy, underrated. Vitali fights Shannon Briggs, who's underrated. Right? Understand, Briggs had a secret. Briggs is a diabetic. But Briggs is a guy who knew how to box. Right? Briggs is actually one of the more skilled heavyweights in recent memory. And folks, the fight's not close. You're watching that fight and you want the ref to stop it. Briggs is completely outgunned. Briggs can't reach Vitali. Right? Vitali, who knew how to fight long, who knew how to leverage his height, reaches a point where he's just playing the role of sniper against Shannon Briggs. It's a miracle that fight went the distance. Right? Now, the knock on Vitali Klitschko, right, is the fact that Vitali Klitschko, like a lot of these tall guys, didn't really have a back foot. It wasn't like he was going to get on his toes and start dancing and start moving backward. Let's talk about a guy who did. And let me say, too, one of the regrets I have in making this list is saving this guy for last. Right? Because this guy really is among the very best I've seen. Right? He used to be Ali's sparring partner. Right? One of boxing's best interviews. He gave an interview once where he was talking about how proud his family was. And he talked about how they came to a training camp to see him. And of course, he was in the ring with Ali. And he talked about how in front of his family, Ali beat him up. Right? And he was angry because he thought Ali went above and beyond embarrassing him in front of his family. So he later fights Ali. At this point, he's the favorite going into the fight. Understand, he's the heavyweight champ. Ali is diminished to the point where he had lost to Leon Spinks. So in the fight, Larry Holmes gets the upper hand against Ali, starts battering Ali. And then something clicked in Larry. Rather than embarrass the guy who gave him a break, he starts turning to the referee to stop the fight. This is while the fight's happening, folks. Right? Folks, please look at that fight, the later rounds. It's jarring. Right? Eventually, Angelo Dundee has to pull the plug. right? But understand, it's jarring. Ali would later go on to fight Trevor Burbeck and go the distance against him. Just food for thought. Against Larry Holmes, he had no chance. Now, Larry Holmes had a 10 out of 10 jab, and it's a mobile jab. Right? Understand, the trend here on this list is the jab. Right? Ali, great jab, mobile jab. Liston, 10 out of 10 jab. Not mobile, but spectacular. Right? A 2x4 type jab, a Carlos Monzon level jab. Tyson Fury, excellent jab, mobile jab. On a 6'9" guy. George Foreman, 10 out of 10 jab. Right? Great jab. Right? Foreman, if he's landing the jab, would not need another punch. Right? Lennox Lewis, excellent jab. Larry Holmes, the gold standard jab. Right? Larry had legs too. Open question on Foreman's back foot, Sonny Liston's back foot, Vitali Klitschko's back foot. There's no question on Larry Holmes' back foot. Right? Let me say too, in terms of timing, you can't do better than Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes is fighting Jerry Cooney. Cooney, spectacular left hand. Right? Spectacular left hand. Larry Holmes is out there. He knows all about the left hand. Folks, that's not gonna land. Right? I'm just telling you simply, that left hand was not gonna land. Larry Holmes had the kind of holistic approach. Let me use the Kamala Harris word here. Holistic approach. Where, if you were a one-handed fighter, you had no chance. Right? It's true that he gets knocked down by people like Ernie Shavers. Shavers is two-handed. Right? Jerry Cooney had no chance to land that left hook. Then Larry waits him out. Right? Cooney would throw the left hook, Larry would take a step back, then Larry would jump in with his own flurries. Right, folks, that fight is over. Cooney entered that fight unbeaten. Understand, Larry was the experienced veteran who knew when to strike. Right? Larry was a guy who punchers looked ordinary against. That Ken Norton fight, Larry actually pulls away in that fight. Right? Let me say this. The Ernie Shavers rematch, that's probably Larry's worst moment. Right? Larry hits the canvas, he's hurt, he gets up, he does not look like he knows where he is. What happens next, many of the other guys couldn't do. Injured, Larry Holmes gets on his toes and starts dancing. He dances away from Ernie Shavers as he's trying to clear his head. Folks, you wouldn't see dancing like this from a Lennox Lewis, who just didn't have this level of legs or footwork. You wouldn't see it from a Klitschko. You saw it from Larry Holmes. Right? This was an intelligent fighter. This was a guy who was unbeaten, made the mistake as he was going for Marciano's record. He needed one fight. Made the mistake of fighting Michael Spinks, who could have been on this list had he stayed at heavyweight a little bit longer. Right? Understand, he beats Larry Holmes twice. He had the best fight ever outside of a fight years later, Cooney against George Foreman. He had the best fight ever against Jerry Cooney. Right? Michael Spinks, one of the dominant light heavyweights in history. He didn't have the cruiserweight division then. Jumped up to heavyweight. He'd be on this list if he didn't get destroyed by Mike Tyson in one round and if he stuck around the division. Well, understand, Larry Holmes, past his prime, made the mistake of fighting Michael Spinks, who, of course, was mobile, who had the Spinks jinx punch, who was training out of where else? Philadelphia. Right? Michael Spinks talks about being in some gym, having to pay fees, even though he was one of the dominant light heavyweight champs in history, and training against heavyweights in the normal course. He had to pay to train against heavyweights, and how tough the Philly fighters were. Right? Well, that's Larry Holmes' misstep. Because understand, at that point, he was clearly one of the best heavyweights in history. And he's on my list. Now, the problem with Larry Holmes is the same problem Lennox Lewis has. Too much math. In other words, if Larry Holmes was fighting you and he figured out you couldn't get past his jab, it would be a dull fight. Right? Don't get me wrong. Larry's winning most of the rounds, but Larry would just live off that jab. Just like Lennox Lewis against David Tua, that's a dull fight. Right? Even though Tua is mowing through the heavyweight division, Lennox Lewis knew, I can control this guy with my jab. Right? So both of these guys have their critics where we say, oh, Larry was dull. I'm so glad Mike Tyson came along. Right? Just understand, I would take Larry Holmes over prime Mike Tyson. Right? The Larry Holmes who Mike Tyson fought had already been through Carl the Truth Williams and Ronaldo Snipes and, had been champion for several years. Right? Larry had legs most of the guys on this list, apart from Ali, did not have. Right? You're talking about rare talent with Larry Holmes. Now let's talk about a guy who, as I was making this video, he came into my mind and I thought, maybe he belongs on the list. I'll have to think this one through a little bit because of his fights with Jersey Joe Walcott. But Ezzard Charles, I want people to understand that Ezzard Charles killed a man at light heavyweight. Right? He's one of the dominant light heavyweights in history. He decided to gain weight to fight at heavy. Right? Ezzard Charles, of course, ends up beating Joe Louis. Ezzard Charles fights Rocky Marciano, goes the distance with Rocky Marciano. Should have beaten Marciano. The first fight where he splits Marciano's nose open and the referee goes to the Marciano corner. Refs do this in fights. And said to Marciano, hey, I'll give you one more round. Then I'm going to stop the fight. And Marciano got the KO in that next round. Right? Ezzard Charles figured out against Marciano, it's one of the great moments in history, strategy-wise. He figured out that he could put his head close to Marciano's chest. And Rocky, great puncher, would have a hard time finding him. Right? By the way, same move in Gilberto Ramirez's last fight. Right? Just food for thought. Ramirez, cruiserweight champion. Ezzard Charles, excellent. The problem, of course, is he has a series of fights with Jersey Joe Walcott. The guy who Rocky Marciano would eventually beat in a fight Marciano's badly losing. Right? And understand, Walcott is interesting because Walcott, of course, knocks down Joe Louis twice in one of history's biggest robberies, and they gave Louis that fight. Now you have to have the line someplace. I'm going to put the line after Larry Holmes, although I will say, in terms of pound for pound, right, Ezzard Charles certainly deserves a lot of consideration. The heavyweight division has some deserving fighters here. But I'm going to limit my list here to the top 7. Ali, in the 60s. Liston, early 60s. Tyson Fury, 2015-ish. George Foreman. Foreman's the only guy I'm going to give broad latitude to. Because the Foreman who came back actually delivered on the promise. Right? Foreman, in the early 70s, he's clearly on this list. The Foreman who comes back is among the best. Let's just say I was hoping we would get a fight between Foreman and Mike Tyson. Right? The hardest puncher of the 70s against the hardest puncher of the 80s in the 90s. That would have been a riveting fight. Mike Tyson, 1987-ish, 1988-ish. Lennox Lewis, I would say around the Holyfield period, right? And Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes and, let's say Holmes, the Holmes that fought Jerry Cooney. That's the height of Larry Holmes' reign. You need to remember his name. Let me point out, too, that Larry Holmes is unambiguous. He's as unambiguous as Ali is in telling you who's the greatest of all time. Right? Ali believes it's him. Larry Holmes believes it's him. Right? Just understand, they were both involved in the Thriller in Manila show. Larry Holmes was on the boxing guard. They both sparred together for years. Right? Let me just say that Ernie Shavers fought both. And Ernie Shavers believes that Larry Holmes had the better jab and that Larry Holmes was the more complete fighter. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Let me close by saying, of course, as great as Larry Holmes was, he did not fight the Ali from the 1960s who beat Cleveland Williams in a fight that I feel shows a skill set that would give Ali an edge on everyone else on this list. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. I understand some people are going to name guys who are a little bit off-road, right? Sam Langford. Certainly I can't argue with the resume, right? I'm sure I'm going to hear, if you love Ezzard Charles, why don't you have the guy who beat Ezzard Charles twice? Rocky Marciano on your list, right? I'm sure some old-timers, my dad had a friend who kept talking about Floyd Patterson, right? Now, this was before the internet. This was before the internet. So I've actually had an opportunity to look at Floyd against Ingemar Johansson and Floyd against Ali and stuff like that. But let's just say I understand. We all see the sport differently. I know I'm going to hear from the Joe Louis crowd, right? Spectacular short puncher, right? My problem with Louis is simply the foot speed to me is not there, right? I believe Louis came along at a time when the heavyweight division was depleted by World War II. Understand what that did, right? It not only drained the American heavyweight division, it drained the world heavyweight division. So you have Louis fighting people like Tony Galento, right? You have Louis fighting what the New York press called the Bum of the Month Club, right? Let's just say Louis goes through a stretch there, and he's the longest reigning heavyweight champion. But Louis goes through a stretch there where he's not fighting big-time, meaningful opponents, right? He's just not. Then when he steps up his game, folks, I'm sorry, I have Jersey Joe Walcott winning the fight where Walcott drops Louis twice. Understand, Louis thought he had lost the fight because Louis, before they announced the winner, was leaving the ring. It's Louis's corner that talked Louis into staying in the ring. And just understand, it would have been preposterous for Louis to have won that fight and then have been outside of the ring where the ref couldn't raise his hand, right? Louis, of course, against Marciano, Louis gets knocked out of the ring. The Ezzard Charles fight, Louis, by that point's diminished. Ezzard Charles is able to come inside on Joe Louis and do damage against him, right? So, you know, with the recognition that I was raised where when I was a kid, my dad would take me to a barber shop, and there was a barber there named Jerry. We'd start talking about boxing, and all of these older black men started talking about Joe Louis, right? There was Louis, there was Ali, then there was the rest of the sport. I recognize that many of you believe in Joe Louis. I recognize that in terms of social impact, right? Heavyweight champion who sets the way champs wear the crown. I understand that Lewis, Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, they're certainly on the list, right? If you want to tell us Lewis stories, please feel free to do so in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.